So today's message is part one in a series called The Path to Power. And the theme is humility. So why in the world would humility be the first step along a path to power? Doesn't the word humility itself conjure up images of the legendary Casper milquetoast, mild, meek, shy? Humility does not seem to be something we see demonstrated a lot today. What we do hear a lot about is power, power, power. Yet in the Beatitudes, Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now that's interesting. To begin, I invite you to settle back and listen to one of the most familiar and beloved of Bible stories. Now the Philistines and the Israelites were mortal enemies. One morning the two armies gathered for battle. The Philistines atop a mountain on one side of the valley of Elah, and the Israelites atop a mountain on the other side. Out from the Philistine camp strode a champion named Goliath of Gath. Now Goliath was huge, nearly 10 feet tall by today's measure. He was covered in bronze armor and a suit of mail, the weight of which was said to be nearly 150 pounds. And he carried a spear the size of a tree trunk. In a booming voice, Goliath shouted to the Israelites, "Have you come here to do battle? Well, let's settle this the easy way," my paraphrase. "Choose one of your men to come down and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your servants, but if I kill him, you will be our servants." When King Saul and the Israelites heard these words, they were very frightened indeed. They knew they had no one who could prevail against Goliath. Now David was the youngest son of Jesse. His 3 older brothers were in Saul's army. David himself went back and forth between the army and his home in Bethlehem, for he had responsibility for tending his father's sheep. For 40 days, both before and after the fighting between the armies, Goliath shouted out the same scary message. One day, Jesse sent David to take food to the battleground and check on his brothers, and he arrived at the Israelite camp in the early morning, just as Goliath was bellowing out his challenge. He heard Goliath, and he also heard the frightened soldiers, Israelite soldiers, murmuring to one another, "What are we going to do? We have no one mighty enough to stand up to this giant. Have you heard? King Saul has offered great wealth and actually the hand of his daughter in marriage to the one who can kill this beast." Young David drew himself up to his full height and said, "Who does this Philistine think he is? Does he think he can destroy God's army?" So he said to King Saul, "I, your servant, will go and fight Goliath." To which Saul replied, "Are you crazy?" My paraphrase. "You're just a boy, totally unprepared for battle." But David stood tall and said, "For years I've tended my father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear would take a lamb from the flock, I would strike it down and rescue the lamb from its jaws. I have killed lions and bears. Is this giant any different? The Lord who saved me from those savage beasts will save me from this infidel." So Saul said, "Okay, go then, and may God be with you." So they suited David up with armor and a coat of mail and put a bronze helmet on his head, and David strapped Saul's own sword over the armor and tried to walk, but he could not. All this stuff was way too heavy for him. So he removed it, and instead he took up his staff and his slingshot and placed 5 smooth stones in his pouch and strode confidently out to meet the Philistine. When Goliath saw David, he was insulted and filled with contempt. What am I, a dog, that you come at me with your sticks? Come closer so that I may feed your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Pretty nasty guy. But David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord God of Israel. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down, so that everyone will know that there is a God, and everyone will see that the Lord does not save by sword or spear. Goliath, now very angry, moved forward to attack David, and David ran quickly toward him, reaching into his pouch and placing a stone in his sling and drawing it back. He let fly the stone and hit Goliath smack in the middle of his forehead. The stone sank deep into his head, and Goliath fell face down on the ground. And this is how David prevailed over Goliath, with a sling and a stone. When the Philistine army saw their champion killed in this way, they fled in panic. Okay, so this story does not seem to teach humility in the way it is most often understood. The characters do not seem to be very meek at all. Even though David is young and physically small, he is certainly no shrinking violet. In fact, he is confidence personified. And Goliath, well, he is completely obnoxious in his boastfulness. He sees himself as totally invulnerable. This story is a favorite in children's Bibles. It's used to teach the power of faith over obstacles, and it certainly does that. But I've always questioned telling it to kids because it is so violent. In the end, David drives that stone deep into Goliath's forehead, and that's graphic enough, an image. But here's the part I didn't read this morning. The story goes on to tell how David runs up to the fallen Goliath, drives a sword through his neck, and cuts off his head. Then the Israelites chase the fleeing Philistines and mow them all down. It's pretty gross. While this all makes for compelling drama, maybe even bloody enough for stages today, the real strength of the story lies in its metaphysical interpretation. The thoughts that occupy our minds have varying degrees of power. Some are large, loud, and strong. Some are weak and small. Some are oppressive, aggressive, domineering Goliaths that shout incessant threats of disaster and calamity. These are the ones that have the power to keep us frightened into submission. They constantly tell us that there will be dire consequences should we dare to stand up to or oppose their reign in consciousness. They incessantly berate us with the idea that something terrible will happen should we dare to step outside the box of our past experiences, or even seriously entertain creative or more expansive and adventurous idea. These inner voices are very, very powerful, even when we intellectually know they are error thoughts. Unity's co-founder, Charles Fillmore, says they are woven into our whole mental fabric. The overcoming of Goliath by David illustrates the mastery of spiritual thought over those fear thoughts, which, when you think about it, are like our own personal inner terrorists. Goliath trusted in his armor, which represents the protective power of material goods and intellectual knowledge and physical strength. David, who represents spiritual strength, wears no armor or material protection at all. His power comes through trust in divine mind. By heeding the divine ideas that flow from universal intelligence, he is able to discern the place where Goliath is most vulnerable. Using the sling of his concentrated and focused will, he sends a pebble of truth into Goliath's fearful mind, an idea so powerful it shatters and kills the giant's error consciousness. On the metaphorical level, this story teaches that it is possible to overcome even seemingly overwhelming material conditions when we take actions based on the wisdom and guidance of God. But the metaphysical description is even more powerful. On the metaphysical level, it shows how the lightning bolt of truth received deep in the unarmored or open mind can instantly cause the death of the old consciousness and the birth of a totally new awareness. David was confident as he prepared to stand up to Goliath because of his experience overcoming wild animals in his father's pasture. The wild animals represent what Charles Fillmore calls sense consciousness, or the drive for physical and material pleasure, comfort, safety, and worldly power. By subduing these wild thoughts over and over again, David had gained a mighty soul strength. Now, Goliath's power existed primarily in his ability to frighten the Israelites. Their fear of him was induced by his great size and his loud roar, but physical and material prowess is prone to pride and vanity and boasting, and herein lies its weakness. By approaching the giant in a simple, inoffensive, and seemingly vulnerable manner, David aroused his contempt. Goliath, knowing nothing of spiritual power, underestimated David and thus became very easy to defeat. Goliath stood on faith in his personal power alone. David went forward with true humility, with no need to prove anything about himself, but with one purpose only: to demonstrate the enormous power of God. And it got me to thinking, could it be that humility and confidence go hand in hand? Never in my lifetime have we been so confronted by the life and death duel between the ego's drive for personal domination and the soul force of humanitarian values. People are walking through our media-driven world as physical embodiments of this struggle. But while we see this play out on the world stage, we should not be deceived into thinking it is about the other. This battle is intensely personal. My soul knows this, doesn't yours? Back and forth we go, between fear and faith, dread and hope, anger and love, blame and responsibility. We are in a battle for the soul of America, yes we are, but what is America? It is you and it is me. And until our personal David and Goliath battle is soundly won by David, the struggle and the suffering will continue. Whenever we try to meet a challenge through personal power and strength alone, we are bound to be filled with fear, to become exhausted, and to come up short of our goal. But when our ego has been sufficiently subdued through spiritual growth, which, let's face it, is usually a byproduct of repeated failures and disappointments, we take on that challenge confident, not in ourselves, but in the power of God working in the world, working every single day through each one of us. In this awareness, we find ourselves guided every step of the way, stronger than we've ever been, able to do what we could not do before, and amazingly, able to do it with very little angst or effort. This is true humility, and it lies in the paradox that real power begins with personal powerlessness. It begins with a word, if we're really honest about it, many of us tend to dislike a lot, and that word is surrender. Unity principles tell us that there is only one God, and its nature is absolute good and absolute love. That we human beings are offspring of God and made of this God stuff. Unity students embrace the third principle, that law of attraction, that we create our reality through our thinking. But this principle is often misunderstood. Our power does not lie in our human thinking. The real secret lies in the fourth principle, which is all about prayer and meditation. Our power to overcome life challenges, create our heart's desire, or do good in the world depends upon the degree to which we align our minds with divine mind. The degree to which we stand up to our mental terrorists and set them aside and invoke God wisdom and God power to do the work which Spirit would have us do. The story of David and Goliath points out the conflict between our desire for both spiritual and worldly growth and success. Each in turn occupies utmost importance in our minds. It is not intellectually difficult to grasp the futility of placing our faith in material success and power, but it requires very definite action to correct the habit of doing so. Faith in money, prestige, and political power is nearly overwhelming to the one who does not fully realize the power of truth. And what is this truth? Well, Jesus said it often. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all else will be added to you. If these words would become our mantra, if we would drive them deep into our minds and hearts, the world would open itself up to us. We are often scared, even terrified by the thoughts in our own minds. The content of our Goliath may be different from that of our neighbor, but all of us have in common that we are intimidated and held back and held down by our own fears and catastrophic thoughts. Those of us who believe our only resources are material, political, and personal will always kowtow to those who supply those resources. What else can we possibly do? Relentlessly bullied by our fears, we constantly scan the world for threats, and self-protection becomes our primary motivation. Every single one of us has his or her own Goliath. But some of us have been blessed with an understanding that completely changes our reality. That the only way to subdue this bully is through the power of humility as represented by David the shepherd boy. Only deep love of and total reliance on truth can send us forth with confidence, courage, and the power to overcome all obstacles and be free. So the story of David and Goliath may seem like a child's story, but understood metaphysically, it leads us to a remarkable conclusion. That we do not fear what is actually happening as much as we fear what we think might happen in the future. These are our personal terrorists, and they can never be overcome by force. For force only causes them to dig in their heels, and you know what I mean. But they are extremely vulnerable to the power of love and principle and compassionate self-honesty. When our motivation shifts from the desire for power over the things we fear to the desire to demonstrate the overcoming, creating power of God, evidence of this God power begins to mount up. Gradually, problem after problem falls at our feet. Success after success comes to us. Faith and happiness settle into our souls, and gradually we learn that truly all things are possible with God. So take a lesson from the New England turtle who wanted to spend the winter in Florida. He knew he could never walk that far, so he convinced a couple of geese to help him. Each one took one end of a piece of rope while the turtle clamped on with its vice-like jaws in the center. The fight was going just fine until someone on the ground looked up in admiration and called out, "Who in the world thought of that idea?"
Oh, no.
Unable to resist the chance to take the credit, the turtle opened his mouth to shout, "I did!" Well, you can guess the rest. And that is why there are so many turtles in North Carolina.